Hey everyone, it's Joe Kral with the Society of St. Sebastian, and again, welcome to Pro-Life University. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button. We always appreciate it. Hit like, and don't ever hesitate to share with your family and friends. This week, we're going to focus on something interesting that's been going on this week, and that is dealing with abortion funding. Just a few things to let you know about. So, for example, towards the beginning of this month, actually it was kind of last week when this happened, but Missouri's Supreme Court had ruled that the state legislature actually had to fund Planned Parenthood. This obviously gets into some critical, not just legal issues, but moral issues here that we really need to dive into. Not to mention there's been a lot of talk with respect to some Democrat proposals in the U.S. House of Representatives pushing to funding abortion through foreign aid and so forth. And not to mention, and going back to Missouri, Governor Parsons actually had signed a measure in which he was giving public funds to abortion alternatives, that obviously being a good thing. And so today we're going to kind of dive into this particular issue of abortion funding and obviously the reasons why it's not a good. Now, again, most pro-lifers are going to all agree government should not fund abortion. Why? The most simplest, easiest answer is because abortion kills an innocent human life, right? And that's true, right? That's what it does. And that's certainly one of the most fundamental reasons why it's wrong. But let's explore this a little bit further if we can. Let's talk about, for example, and I discussed this a little bit last week with respect to the June v. Russo decision that was handed out by the U.S. Supreme Court, and that's the issue of the idea of rights. Right? We have to remember that rights imply duties. Right? I have certain duties to you, and this is a very important sort of thing when it comes to the realm of morality. Right? So my duties to the other person means that other person derives a right from my moral obligations. Right? And so this is why we would say that abortion is not a right, because there is no moral duty to kill innocent human life. In fact, it's quite the opposite. There is a duty to preserve innocent human life. And so since there is no right to abortion, and in fact, since we know that killing innocent human beings is a wrong, is a moral wrong, precisely because they haven't done anything that warrants that sort of penalty, if you will, there is no obligation for the government to fund these sorts of things. The simple fact is when it comes to this, and one of the arguments that you can certainly use when discussing with other people is that since abortion is not a right, and since there is no duty to kill innocent human life, then the simple fact is that there's no obligation for the government to fund such an activity. So that's an important thing to note here. So fundamentally, from a moral perspective, we can certainly argue quite well that there is no obligation to fund an activity such as this. And as a result, the simple fact is that if governments, or state governments in particular, if they are funding this sort of thing, that gets into some problematic issues as well. Now, some of the things that we should probably look at with respect to this issue is what about these states, for example, that fund abortions for rape and incest? Well, again, I think we need to go back. And again, this gets into some what we would call metaphysical questions here. Is the child that is conceived, even at that moment of conception, the same human being? Does it have the same sorts of rights as a human being that's conceived in a natural act, an act of love between consenting adults? And obviously, I think morally, most people would say yes, and that is true, right? The simple fact is that child, even if conceived in rape or incest, is still a child that is a human being, and as such has inherent dignity and has rights as a human being. Right? So the simple fact is just because a child is conceived in an act of violence, or an immoral act at that, that doesn't diminish their personhood, if you will. Their personhood still remains. And again, we can sort of look at this from a scientific perspective. The simple fact is if you were to place an embryo in a dish that was conceived through rape, in an embryo that was conceived by a husband and wife through natural love, and you told the scientist, okay, well, tell me which one is conceived out of rape, he wouldn't be able to do it. The simple fact is because it's still a human being, it has a full genetic code. There's nothing inherently different about this child. The child does not carry the sins of the father, so to speak. And so this child is innocent of the crime. This is why we have such groups out there that fight against legislation that have these sorts of exceptions. So groups like Save the One, for example, or one of my good friends, Jennifer Christie, who's a well-known pro-life speaker who goes around talking about this particular sort of thing as well, and talking about the wrongness of having these sorts of exceptions. So in these states, for example, where they may have these exceptions, one of the things that the pro-life movement may want to look at is removing these exceptions as well, because we have to recognize that these children, all these children, are human beings. Plainly put, it doesn't matter how they were conceived. The simple fact is that they are, that they exist, and as such, they deserve human rights. And so I think that's an important point to understand here. Now, one of the things that we obviously need to also kind of cover, if you will, is this idea of funding for abortion alternatives, for crisis pregnancy centers, or for groups that might provide information for these women and so forth. These are good things, and the simple fact is that is a good thing for public funds to go and help promote. The idea of promoting life, that life is sacred, that even if the child is conceived in, let's just say, unfortunate circumstances, or circumstances that are not ideal. The simple fact is that the state is basically saying, by providing money for abortion alternatives, is that indeed this life is sacred, and we are willing to spend the money to show you that this life is sacred as well. That's why we want to give money to these abortion alternatives, to these organizations that provide abortion alternatives and so forth, because life itself is indeed sacred. So here we are, all right? We can definitely see, since there is a duty to protect life, since we have that moral duty, in many ways we can say that the state has an obligation to move in ways that helps promote, this idea that human life ought to be protected within the womb. And I think, again, funding for these sorts of measures is a good thing. It extends from that duty, right? Since that child has a right to life, since that child has a right to exist. So, these sorts of funding measures go and help promote that sort of thing. Whereas this idea that abortion ought to be funded, just simply put, doesn't hold water, if you will. Just the simple fact is that since abortion's not a right, since there is no duty to kill innocent human life, the simple fact is that government's not obligated. In fact, the government is obligated to not fund such activities. The simple fact is because by funding, it certainly lends this idea that it's okay to get an abortion. Whereas if the government doesn't fund, it lends this idea and goes into this idea that people comprehend and would understand that abortion is not okay. And we shouldn't do it because, just simply put, the state isn't going to provide funds for people to get abortions. So in many ways, we can see kind of the in-depth attitudes that are going on with respect to just this one issue. I mean, here, I've been talking almost 10 minutes about it. And so we can get into this little deeper sort of conversation, right? Well, I hope some of this has been insightful for you. I appreciate everyone that's coming in and watching a little bit more. Again, don't hesitate to share this with your friends and family. Don't hesitate to give us a big thumbs up. We always appreciate it. And again, guys, if you get the opportunity, subscribe to our channel so you can be one of the first to watch when these come up every week. And again, we appreciate everything that you do. I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend, and God bless.